Welcome, everyone. This is the second talk in the IndoPhon talk series. Thank you all for joining us for the second talk. I would like to introduce myself. My name is Indone. I'm a professor of linguistics at Jadavpur University. Before we get on to today's talk, I just wanted to give you an idea of how sort of IndoPhon came about. So IndoPhon came out of a need to sort of highlight speech-related research in Indian linguistics and to create kind of a formal community environment which was dedicated to the development of and dissemination of wider audiences in India and outside. We kind of pivoted from the current situation and to transform this idea into reality. The big questions that we have in our minds at the moment are, so given the limited resources and lack of access to data and funding issues during the pandemic, how do we approach laboratory research in the present and foreseeable future in a fully online or part online mode? In an effort to be able to fuel these ideas and thoughts, we have begun the IndoPhon talk series, and for that we are very grateful and thankful to all our speakers for helping us to help the Indian speech community, research community, find a way to continue to provide students and researchers with learning opportunities and providing the spark necessary to further innovative ideas. In addition to this talk series, our long-term goals are to be able to initiate and foster further sort of diverse conversations within phonetics and phonology. At the moment, we are a small working group of phoneticians and phonologists based in India. We have Amalesh Gop from Tejpur University, Renu Punnos from IIT Palakkad, Shakuntala Mohanto from IIT Guwahati, and Shomdev Kaur from IIT Ropar. But we are hoping that we will be able to build a pan-India collective of speech-related researchers, teachers, to form strong networks within some individuals, groups, and labs around the globe. The inaugural series of IndoPhon therefore reflects both our diverse interests within phonetics and phonology and also our goal to bring together students, researchers, and faculty interested in phonetics and phonology. I would encourage you all to visit our webpage, and the webpage is basically shared on the description box in the YouTube video. For more details about the talk series and how you could engage with phonetics and phonology and the community in India and elsewhere. Do subscribe and press the bell icon to be notified for the upcoming IndoPhon events. Also follow us on Facebook and Twitter. All of these details, the social media details, should also be available on our description box. In addition to the IndoPhon talk series, concurrent to the IndoPhon talk series, I should say, we are also initiating a discussion platform which is called No Coda, as in hashtag No Coda, which is a knowledge and collaborative discussion agora. And it's a community of researchers who want to build a non-hierarchical research and collaboration framework, which emphasizes the need for free flow of ideas, questions, data, methods, and science. We believe that constant and curiosity-filled engagement with science is what would free it from already existing socially constructed hierarchies within this broad goal. The functional practices involve a constant dialogue, discussion that builds on already existing frameworks. For instance, Open Science Forum and so on. No Coda is hosted on a server on Discord, so follow hashtag No Coda on Twitter for discussions around the talks we host at IndoPhon. The idea being that as we have the talks, we should be able to have a concurrent discussion following the talks in the Discord server around these talks. Join us also next week for what promises to be a very exciting event. KP Mohanan and Tara Mohanan in conversation about leading ideas in phonetics and phonology with a historical perspective. So for the second talk in the IndoPhon talk series, we have the distinct pleasure of having Professor Preeti Rao. We are indeed privileged to have Professor Rao give us a talk on evaluating oral reading skills with acoustic prosodic features. Professor Rao is on the faculty of electrical engineering at IIT Bombay. teaching and researching in the area of signal processing with applications in speech and audio. She received her PhD from the University of Florida in Gainesville in 1990. Her research interests include speech recognition, speech prosody, and music information retrieval. She has been involved in development of technology for Indian music and spoken language learning applications. She also co-founded SensiBowl Audio Technologies, a startup incubated by IIT Bombay in 2011 with her PhD and master's students. Professor Rao will speak to us on evaluating oral reading skills with acoustic prosodic features. Please do put in your questions in the comment section, in the YouTube comment section. There will be a discussion following Professor Rao's presentation. Please join me in welcoming Professor Preeti Rao. So, Professor Rao, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Indranil. I'm going to just start by sharing my screen, just as we rehearsed. Okay, so I hope my screen is visible. Okay, so I'd like to start by thanking the organizers of the IndoPhon talk series, everyone, Indranil, Shakuntala, Somdev, Reenu, and Amalesh, for having invited me to this forum. It's a real pleasure being here. And of course, for all the effort behind organizing something as big as this. And I thoroughly enjoyed the first talk, and I look forward to everything that's coming ahead in this series. I'd also like to thank the audience for taking the time off to be at this talk. And of course, my apologies for the last minute cancellation that happened last week. Okay, so the topic of my presentation is about evaluating oral reading skills with acoustic prosodic features. So let me get started by telling you a bit about oral reading, or what is more commonly understood as reading aloud. So oral reading actually is an important indicator of reading ability. And in fact, it is traditionally used to evaluate critical literacy proficiencies. That is not only the ability to recognize the written word and to articulate it, but also the understanding of language and the use of language in new contexts. So something that is termed, I think, linguistic performance. And it turns out that while you can, gauge understanding by asking questions, for example, to a child who is asked to read a text, it turns out that just listening to the child reading aloud can provide, valuable clues to the extent of comprehension. Of course, to the ease of decoding, but also to the extent of comprehension. So our objective in our work was to really build a system, an automatic system for the assessment of oral reading from recordings. And we are doing this specifically in the context of second language learning, particularly, in this particular exercise, English, and for specific groups of children, that is, early school years, primary and middle school. And the expertise that we bring to this problem is of speech signal processing and machine learning, by which is meant that we are going to learn from data. As you can imagine, and as we also realize, some understanding of linguistics can be invaluable to our work. And of course, I'll try to bring some of that out, but I'm really nervous, talking about the topic in a forum like this. So please bear with me if I sound a bit labored about, some topics that maybe, are extremely, familiar to you. Okay, so what's the motivation for this work? There are a lot of organizations and bodies that actually use oral reading as a form of, large-scale monitoring of educational outcomes. So, for example, there is this American body, the NCES, which actually carries out a large-scale oral reading across, the schools, across the country. And here is an example of a report that they brought out, which actually prescribes, various kinds of protocols, processes, rubrics, and of course, does a critical analysis of the results. So such is the importance of oral reading in terms of language literacy and language education. And of course, closer to home, we have this very impressive, survey that is carried out annually by Pratham, and known as the ASAR test, which involves a very large number of trained volunteers fanning out across villages, districts, towns in India, to essentially go and get a good statistical sample of children in schools, and somehow assess their literacy, language, as well as arithmetic skills. So this, the volunteers, the reading part, the language part of it involves presenting some carefully designed material to the child who reads it aloud, and the trained volunteer is able to make certain judgments about the level of the child from the read aloud, component, and place the child on a certain scale. And that's something that they bring out as a report every year. Okay, so the outline for my talk is going to be the following. I'll talk a bit about the rubrics that are used in oral reading assessment. And then come to the signal correlates of these different attributes. So trying to link, the rubrics with what we can actually measure in the audio signal. We'll talk about the data collection, which is primarily about getting audio recordings, but also very importantly about getting annotated data, because it's learning from data that's actually we're going to use in building our system. And then I'll give you an overview of the design considerations in the system and specific challenges we come across. And of course, this is work in progress, so we'll eventually also discuss some of our research outcomes and also comment on, share some aspects of ongoing work. Okay, so what are those oral reading fluency rubrics? So the main components are the following: accuracy, of basically reading out the word correctly. The speed of reading is also very important. And then there's a third component called expressiveness. Now, speed and accuracy, it turns out they develop concurrently as the earliest gains in beginning readers. And it turns out there's a measure called words correct per minute, WCPM. That's a very common indicator that is used in reading skill assessment. So it involves the following. The teacher, has this paper where the words are numbered. The child is reading out this passage, and the teacher scores, the words as they are uttered, correct and wrong. And then, these are essentially what we call miscues. And at the end of the paragraph, we have a timing, how long the child took to read the section, and we also know the number of mistakes. And that helps us to calculate the words correct per minute. So this is a very common indicator in reading skill assessment. But it turns out that that's really not sufficient, because the children still have to cross a number of levels to become fluent readers. And as children become more fluent readers, they acquire more expressive and more appropriate, what is called oral reading prosody. So in fact, this is what is the focus of this talk. We are going to look at exactly how to measure the so-called fluency or oral reading prosody. So this happens to be joint work with my PhD student, Kamini Sabu. Okay, so what is reading prosody? It's essentially the spoken realization of textual punctuation with added expression to convey meaning and affect. So when you're speaking, you obviously don't have the luxury of the punctuation that we can see when reading, and it has to be somehow conveyed through speech. So the chief components are phrasing, that is the grouping of words based on the syntax, and also the prominence or the emphasis given to the right words. And the right words, that we would like to highlight in the course of speaking are the new or the contrasting information, and of course also the intonation. Now, phrasing and prominence essentially are set to cue the information structure of the text. So they just help us to kind of organize the text as we understand. And they are apparently critical to the listener's ease of comprehension. So all of these phrasing and prominence play a role in presenting the message in a very comprehensible and reduce the cognitive load of understanding the message, which otherwise is just a sequence of words. Now, there are several studies that have indicated that if learners have good word decoding ability, it does not always tell us about their prosody skills. And in fact, these learners span a very wide range of prosody skills. Okay, so coming to more formal evaluation rubrics, so the same, American assessment exercise that I talked about has something called an oral reading fluency scale. So as we might expect, word decoding accuracy, which is the number of reading miscues, as well as the speech rate and the accuracy together, which were represented by this, term WCPM, are both, critical rubrics. But there's another section that talks about fluency. So we have lexical fluency, which is linked to a smooth reading that is devoid of hesitations and repetitions and false starts. And there's another category called the prosodic fluency. And as a matter of fact, it has four distinct levels. So while its chief components are phrasing and prominence, the four levels really come about from observing, beginning readers as they progress and how they climb up in prosodic fluency. So as we just saw, the phrasing is the meaningful chunking of words, whereas prominence is about the emphasis on the right words. Okay, and so in order to first of all understand a little bit more about this information structure, and what is this structure of text that a speaker must properly convey by using phrasing and prominence, I have an example here from this paper by Levi's and Silpachai, actually presented in a second language teaching conference. So we found this really useful in terms of illustrating the proper use of phrasing and prominence in English. So if you look at this sentence, we already have some breaks which have been placed at the so-called phrase boundaries. So we could just read this and let's continue our discussion of pollution. Yesterday, we defined pollution. Today, we'll talk about the impact of pollution. So, those are the phrase breaks. And it's easy to see that we could derive a simplified rule from this, which says that phrase breaks must occur at the end of grammatical clauses. So at the end of sentences and at the end of, subparts of sentences, which should be the grammatical clauses. Let's look at the prominence. So here is how, an indication of the prominent words given in bold. So this not only shows the prominent words, but it also shows the specific syllable that has to be stressed in the course of making the word prominent. So here, if you look at this, there are some words which are in bold. And if we look at some of the rules, we can roughly see that prominent words would generally occur once within a phrase, and importantly, typically on the last content word. So if you look at the first sentence, you see, let's continue our discussion of pollution, right? Yesterday, we defined pollution. So when it does not occur on the last content word, as in the part C, and that's because we have a rule which tells us that the non-final placement will occur when we have some information that's already given in the final location. So we already mentioned pollution before, so it's not entitled to emphasis when it comes back again, and therefore the emphasis has moved to the pre-final word here. So that's something that you will notice, throughout this, where words which are given, even if they come in final position, are not emphasized, but it's the next, closest new word that is emphasized. Okay, so having seen that, it's easy to believe that you really can speak with the so-called correct prosody only if you understand the text, right? Because you have to know what is the syntax and able to group words together. You also have to know what is given information, what is new information. So you essentially need to understand the meaning of the text, and that's the way a speaker makes a decision about the placement of the prosodic events such as boundaries and the prominences. So there are formal studies on the same. In fact, there are studies also very recently, but there's one seminal study, the one by Miller in 2008, which says that a child is able to construct meaning of the text at the time of reading itself. So if the child is using the right prosody, they're actually constructing meaning. This happens even in silent reading, and it definitely happens in reading aloud. And thus, the use of appropriate prosody is indicative of the reader's understanding of the text. So this is a link we are looking for and looking to exploit in terms of being able to assess oral reading in terms of possible comprehension. Okay, so the way we intend to use this is to detect prosodic events in the child's read speech recording. and evaluate reading comprehension based on the comparison of the locations that we detect with the locations that are expected in terms, based on the syntactic and semantic rules that we just discussed applied to that text. Okay, so depending on the text, we come up with these, so-called expected locations, and we use our speech processing to detect the events that are realized by the child, and then hopefully a comparison of these will tell us something about the quality of the child's reading in terms of the prosodic skill or the prosodic fluency. Okay, the acoustic correlates of prosody. So coming now to the signal correlates, these are called supra-segmentals as opposed to the segmentals which deal with, the phone acoustics, the realization of the distinctive properties of the phone segment. On the other hand, the correlates of prosody are more across segments, across the utterance, and they lie in the following: the continuous variation of F0 or fundamental frequency, which of course gives rise to the percept of pitch, the variation of intensity, which is linked to the variation of loudness, and also the segmental duration, by which is meant, for example, the duration of the word, the changing and the relative durations of the different words. Now, all of these give rise to the following percepts. One of them is the phrase boundary. So, for example, a pause occurring in the utterance is strongly indicative of a phrase boundary. Similarly, the lengthening of words, a word lengthened is strongly indicative of a phrase boundary following the word. This is also called a local tempo change or a slowing down at the so-called end of a phrase. Then we also have F0 and intensity and or intensity resets. So at the end of the phrase, we would expect the phrase F0, F0 to reach a certain value and then, abruptly start and at an abrupt different value at the beginning of the next phrase. And similarly for the intensity. As for prominence, salient F0 movements, which express various pitch accents, in the course, over the course of the word, the increased duration and or the increased intensity of the word relative to its neighbors. All of this is in context to the neighboring segments of speech. Increased spectral emphasis. So this is about the higher frequency, the mid and high frequency regions, becoming more intense relative to the low frequency spectrum. This is linked to voice quality, and it of course happens to be a correlate of loudness. So making your speech louder involves not only increasing its intensity, but there is also an influence on the shape of the spectrum. And also, prominent words are often hyper articulated. That is uttered very clearly, reaching all of their articulatory targets. So these are essentially some sort of universal, attributes, across languages that are used to cue boundaries, phrase boundary, and provenance. And of course, as I already mentioned, these have to be seen in the local context, in the sense of, they signal a local change, and therefore it's a comparison of the specific word region with the neighboring words in order to detect significant acoustic changes. Okay, so here I have an example of an F0 contour. Okay, I probably need to get rid of this in order to be able to play this, I think. Yeah, just give me a second. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to play an utterance, which is the sentence which is shown here in this spectrogram. So this is a spectrum of the signal shown across time. And the orange line here is the F0 contour. Okay, so let me play it and then I'll talk about it.
Do you think the sun needs a hat?
Okay, so the sentence was, do you think the sun needs a hat? So we notice that we heard a phrase boundary after think, and that was because of the short pause here between think and the next word. We saw a rising intonation per hat, indicative of the question mode. We also notice a relative prominence on the word sun, and that is because of uh, the extended duration of the word as well as the shape of the F0 contour on the word. Okay, so talking about prosodic cues, it turns out, like I said, the set of acoustic features that we discussed is universal, but the contribution of the different parameters actually varies across languages, and this is especially true of prominence. For instance, there are many studies in American English that have shown that the prominent word has higher F0 relative to its neighbors, higher intensity, and also a longer segment duration. So it has the stress syllable, and that stress syllable essentially is extended, and also at times the entire word becomes extended because of the extension of the syllable. On the other hand, a study that we did for Marathi, and of course, I must tell you that Marathi, like many Indian languages, has flexible word order. And so there are other means of cueing prominence apart from prosody. For example, the syntax. So the word order can be changed to bring the most important information to the beginning of the sentence and so on. But when prosody is used, it turns out that the acoustic cues are longer segment durations, as well as post-focal compression of the F0 span. So this is also something that Samir discussed very well in the first talk of the series. So we would expect that L2 learners would exhibit some L1 or first language influences. So at this point, I would say that it's between languages, it's not just about the location of the prominence, but also or the phonetic realization of the prominence. So let's say the location of prominence is fixed by, let's say, the so-called new information. The phonetic realization of the prominence might differ between languages. And also, very importantly, the location of the stress syllable. That also is something that is language dependent. And in fact, there's some excellent work bringing all this out for Indian languages by Professors Mohanan and Lahiri. Okay, the second factor is that the perception of prosodic structure by the listener is actually influenced by top-down cues. So this makes things quite complicated because we have a strong expectation when we are listening, and apart from what the speaker realizes, we tend to perceive something that's kind of influenced not only by what the speaker realizes acoustically, but also by the top-down cues. That's the actual words that are being used. For example, it depends on the frequency of the word. It depends on the part of speech. So, for example, we would expect content words to be emphasized and not function words. And this is actually a real challenge for the current application because we know that our speakers who are language learners, children language learners, they have lower fluency and comprehension levels. So they are not expected to make the so-called correct words prominent. And so we expect some ambiguity on the part of our listeners because we might have conflicting cues between the realization, of the let's say the events, the prosodic events, and what really is implied by the text. Okay, so coming to our data collection, we have a story recording app. So this actually displays to the child a short paragraph of about 50 words, which would typically take a normal speaking child about 20 seconds to speak. The child gets to review the paragraph for a few seconds before starting the reading, and then basically read it aloud, and that's what we record on the app along with metadata about the child. For this part of the study, which involves a prosody evaluation, we select speakers from our data set with good word decoding skills. Because like we said, we had placed the levels so that actually the prosodic fluency arrives in a learner, or a learner acquires prosodic fluency at some point after they are comfortable with word decoding. Okay, so just give you a flavor of the kind of data, and to make a point about how children who are all seemingly very good at reading the words and pronouncing them actually can differ a lot in their prosody. I have some examples here. This is just one sentence from one of the stories. So here's a child with good prosody.
One day, all the animals of a forest gathered to choose their king.
Okay, here we have a relatively monotonous speaker, but let me just play that for you first.
One day, all the animals of a forest gathered to choose their king.
I hope that's audible. I'll just go ahead and increase the volume at my end. So I'll just go back and play this just in case it wasn't audible. So this was the first one.
One day, all the animals of a forest gathered to choose their king. One day, all the animals of a forest gathered to choose their king.
And the third one.
One day, all the animals of a forest gathered to choose their king.
Okay, so you heard the variety. So we had a child who had no expression at all, and then we had a third one who was clearly very expressive, but probably expressive in a sense that was not so related to the text. Okay, so that's the sing-song manner, and there are a lot of children who have this simply probably because of the way they're taught in school. There's so much rotely learning and repeating and so on, and they acquire this kind of style which does not really make them too comprehensible because they're not really conveying using prosody to convey meaning as much as just saying it in a kind of a rhythmic sort of style. Okay, so what do we want to where do we want to go eventually? We'd like to have our automatic system with the following kind of interface. So we have one section which tells about the lexical fluency, essentially which words were uttered wrong, which words were dropped, and so on, and comes up with the lexical mistakes, which would eventually give us that measure that we call the words correct per minute. And then another prosody evaluation section, which would give ratings on the speed, on the quality of phrasing, the prominence, and also some high level attributes, possibly such as did the child sound confident, comprehensibility, how easy to understand was the child, which is also linked in a sense to the comprehension of the child. By cadence, we mean, for want of a better word, was the child sounding sing-song, or did they have some other kind of structure unrelated to the text? And of course, just that overall rating. So you can see from this that if we have to get here, we need data that has been labeled by the right people, hopefully by English teachers and experts who know how to judge spoken language. This is what we would like to use as data to learn from in the course of building our system. Okay, so this we have an interface, where our English experts, do ratings for us. So they get to listen to a paragraph, the kind of paragraph that I showed you in the beginning with the 50 words or so. And then give one rating for each of those attributes which we saw on the previous screen, such as speed, phrasing, comprehensibility, and so on, in a drop-down menu like this. Now, you can imagine that this had to be done very carefully and with a lot of discussion because, we would like to make it easy, but we'd also like to get reliable ratings. We don't want to condition our raters too much by putting words in their mouth. We'd like them to, very quickly and easily conclude where to place the child. So this is really an ongoing exercise, and we've had to essentially do this. We don't really always get this right the first time. Okay, so what are assumptions underlying our system design? The first one, that an expert's rating of comprehension. So let's focus only on one attribute, comprehension. We say an expert listens to a child and is able to rate the comprehension of the child from that instance of oral reading. So an expert's rating of comprehension derives from the judged accuracy of the perceived cues to the information structure. Now, the subjective judgment, this judged accuracy, this is just a hypothesis or an assumption, can be predicted from the observed mismatch between the expected and the realized locations of the boundary and prominence events in the utterance. So given the text, it has a certain information structure. We have certain expected locations for boundary and prominence. And what we are saying here is that the subject essentially listens for those locations. And when they find that the child realizes different locations, that helps them to make a judgment on the comprehension. So you can see that we are really making this very big jump all the way from low-level signal parameters to an expert's holistic score, for the entire 50-word utterance. And the score is some kind of perceived quality of this very long utterance. So, this is going to need a very firm bridge to cross. And of course, we can clearly see that the bridge is going to have many missing pieces because of this kind of connection all the way from low-level signal parameters to something that involves a lot of perception and cognition by a human being. Okay, so these are the basic building blocks of our system. We use those assumptions to set this up. So we have first a stage of what we call prosodic event detection, which detects the phrase boundaries and the prominences in the child's utterance. And this, of course, requires us to segment the utterance into words for which we need to know the text, and we use some kind of automatic speech recognition frameworks to segment the text, segment the utterance into the words, and then evaluate the words in terms of determining in order to determine the locations of the different events. The resulting phrase boundaries and the prominent words are then compared with the reference or the expected information structure in order to obtain ratings of these attributes such as phrasing and prominence. And eventually, we hope that this can be used to get this very high level judgment of comprehension, possibly with the use of more acoustic features, something over and above simple phrasing and prominence. So I'll just start by discussing the first part, which is about detecting prosodic events. And we see that if we are doing this in a machine learning framework, we need annotation of prosodic events, and that's what I talk about. So we need something called prosody transcription for this, which is typically a very arduous task. It involves, expert phoneticians typically who look at spectrograms and use both visual and auditory cues to mark the words that they hear as prominent or not prominent, and to mark where phrase boundaries occur. But we have this really great work by Jennifer Cole's team who sought to simplify the annotation process by crowdsourcing the labeling to relatively untrained or more to larger number of naive raters. And they have this study which showed that the agreement rates for untrained or naive raters tends to stabilize at a cohort size of 7 raters for both boundary and prominence labeling. So the idea is, instead of using 1 or 2 experts, you use a much larger number of naive raters, and then use the ratings together as a whole in order to determine the boundary and prominence. So we use the RPT interface with several untrained raters, and for this study we had 800 story paragraphs by 35 speakers, providing us about 40,000 words, and we had them labeled by 7 raters. Okay, so here is a quick glimpse of the interface. It just shows you the paragraph without any punctuation, so that the rater is not biased. The rater can hear the audio, and the rater can actually then mark these kind of phrase boundaries and also mark the prominent words. So I won't play this because I'll probably run out of time, but it's an extremely convenient interface to use. It's very easy, and of course we have noisy ratings because of naive raters, but on the other hand, the slightly larger number of raters is expected to compensate for that. Okay, so from our data, we obtain these kind of, inter-rater agreements. So we have quite good, or let's say at least moderate agreement for phrase boundary. For prominent word, the agreement is low. And actually, this is fairly common, across the literature. And we also have these observations. That is, we observe complete agreement. That is, all 7 raters agree in about 40 words, 40% of the words for prominence rating, and close to 70% of the words in boundary rating. So there is, varying levels of agreement for 60% of the prominent words. The boundary marking task is found to be much easier, as we can see from rater agreements. In our data, even function words receive prominence and boundary markings. Okay, so that really tells us that our speakers come from a variety of prosodic skills, and obviously are not, placing the prosodic events on the right words always. And of course, there are the poor readers actually give rise to more ambiguity in rating, mainly because of the conflicting cues they present. We have top-down cues telling us something, and then you have children, saying it in what sounds like a different way, and that kind of conflict is something that our listeners or raters have to resolve. Okay, so what's the signal processing for the word-based event prediction? We have the utterance, we compute acoustic features. We use this and the word segments to derive word-level features, which are of one of these categories. They could be pauses, durations, or F0 related features, intensity, spectral shape. And then each of them basically is fed to a trained prominence predictor or a phrase boundary predictor. Okay? So these are distinct suprasegmental attributes. So we derive features under each of these categories. So I just play one example here to show you. Here you can see the F0 contour and the intensity contour. This is the rater. So there was 7 on 7 raters said this was a phrase boundary. 5 on 7 raters thought this word was prominent. So I'll just play this.
While he was sleeping, the tortoise came and cut off his tail.
Okay, so you could hear that, and we see that there is a correlation between the ratings we get, and of course, they're not showing you all the attributes here, but at least between the F naught variation and the length of the word. So sleeping is also a very elongated word. Okay, so the acoustic features for the automatic digital prosodic events are actually derived at the word level and they're aggregated, like each word is represented, let's say, by the maximum value of the feature or the mean of the feature. So we have many, many options here to try. We need to introduce some speaker and utterance level normalization. So for example, your fast speaking speaker, we can't go by absolute durations, they have to be normalized relative to the other words in the utterance. Local changes are important, like we said before, and they can be computed by comparisons with the adjacent words or by using a context window around the word. And finally, we can also fit contours, like we just saw in the previous example, and use those contour shape parameters to determine the prosodic events. And pause, before and after word, subword durations, all of these are also important prosodic cues. So, like we said, we use supervised learning. There are many, many supervised learning schemes available. We use as targets the perception labels that we showed by the naive raters, as continuous values. We use a random forest classifier with these multi-rater perception labels to capture the degree or the strength of the event. We do this in a speaker independent way. So our training set includes many speakers. Our testing set has different speakers from the training set. And then, of course, we have a very large number of features because of all the options I showed you, and we need to apply something called feature selection in machine learning to tailor this set of features to obtain the best set of, a non-redundant and best performing feature set. So here are some results on the boundary prediction. So we see a lot of the feature groups seem to contribute independently. And finally, when we combine across feature groups, we get the best correlation with the perception labels. We get an F score of 0.80, which tells us something about the accuracy. Should we binarize this and reduce it to detection of prosodic events? Similarly, for prominence prediction, we don't see a role for pause there, but we do see all the other features. So F0 turns out to be very important, but so is also spectral balance, which is, like I said, linked to loudness. And together, the features, across these different attributes, actually they contain complementary information, which gives us a higher performance when they are all combined. Okay, so what is really interesting is the speaker variability that we see if we show feature importances speaker-wise. So this figure actually shows, I think, 23 speakers all laid out here on this axis. And it shows on the vertical, the darkest one as the most important, attribute in terms of that speaker's phonetic realization of phrase boundary. Okay, so we see some distinct behavior. So we see that some speakers use pitch more, and some speakers use pauses more to cue phrase boundaries. So when we look closely at the data, we found that the phonetic realization boundaries actually depends on the speaking rate. So the children who had faster rates tended to use pitch and less of pause. which is understandable. They're saving time by not pausing, but they kind of just shift their phonetic realization of phrase boundary to things like pitch resets and pitch shape. Similarly, for prominence, also we have a couple of distinct behaviors. By and large, there are speakers who use spectral shape, which is related to loudness. But there are also some speakers that use pitch. And looking at the data closely, we found that the phonetic realization of prominence is actually depends on the style. So that the sing-song speaker that we heard would be of the variety that uses pitch. They tend to vary their pitch more, whereas the more normal sounding speakers tend to use spectral shape as their most important feature. Okay, so that brings us to the second block, which is still work in progress. So we expect to take these prosodic events, compare them with the reference information structure in some manner, and predict the phrasing and prominence rating that an expert would do, or like our expert data on that form. And then finally, we'd like to use that with possibly other acoustic features to predict comprehension. So how do you get the reference structure? We could apply the rules, but it turns out that's a little difficult. There are many ways to sound right in prosody. So here we have a model speaker, one of our raters speaking, and if you listen to this, you'll see the way she has put boundaries and made words prominent.
One day, 3 tortoises went for a picnic near a pond. They put down the basket of food they had brought at the shore and went inside the pond to enjoy a bath. When they came back, they found a fox eating their food. On being asked, the fox replied, "Anything lying on the ground is public property." So the basket.
Okay, so if we look at this, we find that all the breaks indicated by the rules that we saw earlier from the Lewis-Hilpachai passage are not always realized. So she often goes completely without a break for a large segment. Very often we have two word groupings, right? So there is, she makes both words prominent, as perceived by the listener. We can have phrases without any prominent words. And also there are cases where prominence appears in some way to compensate for phrase breaks. So, when the speaker is speaking fast, they tend to skip phrase breaks, but then they tend to have more prominences. Now, these are purely our observations, and we think we have to take these into account somehow, but that's something that we're still looking at. Okay, now inter-rater agreements are somewhat high for pace, a little bit lower for some of the other attributes. Actually, the inter-rater agreements are not very high, but when we do ranking correlations, in terms of monotonic correspondence, we get slightly better, behavior. And it turns out that predicting comprehensibility from phrasing and prominence, if you use actual perception labels, then we can get an accuracy of about 74%. Okay, so a little bit about predicting the expert ratings, the automatic prediction of expert ratings for goodness of phrasing or prominence. So what kind of features should we use to do that? So this is the block that we saw here, the compute ratings, which takes a reference information structure and the realized events. So what are the features that we could use there? We could count the number of prosodic miscues, but should we normalize for reading speed or not? Does the type of miscue matter? Is it more important to the rater that they skipped certain events, or is it more important, more critical that they introduced some wrong prominences and phrasing? How do we model continuous listening? Does the rater become most influenced by what happened at the start, or more what happened at the end? And finally, how do we normalize across different story durations and different story complexity? So, there are many things to take care of, and the very early work that we started tells us that you can get only about 50% accuracy for 3 levels of phrasing detection, and similarly for prominence detection. So, some of these features really need to be considered, and of course, obviously, we need good data in order to, conclude about the importance of different features. And this is something we already saw. And the question was, okay, what else can we put in to comprehension prediction that will raise the accuracy of comprehension prediction, apart from just phrasing and prominence? Okay, so that brings me to the conclusions, which are, obviously also about the work in progress. So one thing, of course, we saw that, from studies and also from our own data, that children with very good word decoding skills actually do exhibit a wide cross-section of prosodic skills. So that tells us that yes, prosodic fluency is something that is worth studying from the point of view of modeling the rubrics and predicting the levels. Perception-based boundaries and prominent words can be reliably detected by signal-based features with supervised learning. By reliably, just the kind of results I showed, and hopefully we can make that better. Supervised learning means we are essentially the better data and the more data we have, we are hoping to do better. We see fair inter-data agreements for the high-level attributes. We have multiple and possibly interacting cues contributing to our expert judgment. So this is really a complication, and we really need to see, how we bring all this into the picture in a manner that can be handled with the kind of data sizes, set sizes we have, and whatever understanding we have of the interaction. Okay, so that brings me to the various references that we used in this work. And acknowledgements, the project team, comprising of the project staff and students, Nagesh, Kamini, and Sriharsha. We had a large panel of English language teaching experts who gave us invaluable advice in addition to doing our ratings and multiple discussions, and also showed a lot of enthusiasm for this work, which I think really makes it all worthwhile to see that the teachers and the language experts think this has potential. We had support from the Tata Center for Technology and Design at IIT Bombay, not only financial support, but also a lot of help in terms of outreach and making connections with the outside world to bring feedback on how such a system might be usable and so on. So our deepest gratitude to everyone acknowledged here. And finally, thank you. And to be prosodically accurate, I have the markings that we saw before. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'll be very happy to answer questions.
Thank you so much, Professor Preeti Rao. This was really quite a fascinating talk, and also very valuable, right? Because for a country like India, where on the one hand we actually do have programs which are helping with oral reading skills. On the other hand, the assessment is rather poor. And so what tends to happen is that the impact of the kind of research that has gone into, let's say, acquiring reading skills and so on, when those are kind of implemented, it's very hard to figure out whether, and I'm glad that you mentioned Pratham's work on this. So thank you so much. It was really, I learned a lot. So we will open the floor for questions, and we will start with a question from Shakuntala, and Shakuntala is asking, can we extend this test to their native languages? Is it possible that when we do so, we would actually measure their oral reading skills? In this case, we might be measuring their level of acquisition. So I guess, not to rephrase her, but I guess the question is about how language agnostic, I suppose, could we make these? I may be wrong, but that's how I'm thinking. So.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Shakuntala. Actually, language agnostic, it definitely is. Because we are looking at acoustic prosody features, and if we have data in that language rated by experts in that language, we should do just fine. The only thing I'm concerned about is if it's the native language, then they've already learned to speak it quite well before they get into reading. And so I'm not sure, how those levels and rubrics play out. I really haven't seen any literature on that. But, looking at that American one, which actually talks about English, you're probably right that maybe the same rubrics apply for native language. Yeah, but the techniques that we use are actually language agnostic.
Thank you for that question, Shakuntala. We will go into the next question from Preeti Rao. And she's asking when and if this project is extended to new languages, can the acoustic prosodic features of tone languages be incorporated in the model for training tone contrast?
Okay, yeah, I probably will need your help as the linguistic expert on this, Indranil. I agree that, the phonetic realization of, phrase, boundary and provenance might change in tonal languages because of the, multiple uses of tone in those languages. So, like I said, while we are saying is language agnostic, the study really needs to take into account the characteristics of the language in terms of acoustic phonetic realizations, and pretty much start from that level. So yes, we need to take them into account. Yeah.
So related to Preeti Raichodhuri's question is a question from Poroma Shanmal. And I guess that's what Poroma is saying is that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's quite a fascinating, characteristic. And in fact, we saw it even in, Hindi-speaking children. It's actually more because of the style in which, language is taught in our schools. So, teacher reads and children repeat and so on. And that's how they develop that sing-song style. So I have a feeling it's probably not, exclusive to second language. It's more of the way they are taught, and nobody's trying to break that habit, and that's how it's occurring.
So the next question we have from Akshit Jha, and he's asking how is the L1 influence dealt with during such evaluations?
Yeah, you're right, Akshay. That is an important question. So I forgot to mention, I think that most of our data is from Maharashtra, that is schools in and around Mumbai and in towns, outside Mumbai, but within Maharashtra. So a safe assumption there was they were all Marathi speaking natives. Now, in these kind of data-driven systems or systems based on machine learning, we are just hoping that if we have the right data, that will somehow also model for the L1 influence. But like I said, is that we are expecting, acoustic realization of phonetic events to depend on the language. So maybe for Malayalam, we would expect certain kinds of influences, which would be, let's say, different from Marathi. But how we model them, we could do it with the help of a linguist, and come up with some more systematic trends. On the other hand, we could try to use data, but I think a mix of the two would be great, because learning from data is typically it's a pretty challenging kind of situation always.
Yeah. So during I guess one of my comments about this probably would be during the training process, because we are training on acoustic features, fundamental frequency, and so on. Is it possible to basically include some sort of a categorical feature, which could be something as simple as language, or what's the sort of L1 of the speaker, and so on? And does that sort of affect the rating versus? So let's say that if I said that a particular prosodic space, for the lack of a better word, for let's say X language is closer to English, let's say, right? So naturally, if you speak that as an L1, then you will already be close to it. So that the analogy would be that if there was a multidimensional, let's say, vowel space, or multidimensional
right
prosodic space, and if my L1 was already kind of close to that, then naturally, my scores, my ratings will improve, right? So so it'll be kind of cool to sort of include that in the complexity.
Right,
So,
right. And if I can add to that, Indranil, that this L1 influence, it's actually, we are also reevaluating the way we judge a speaker. So for example, accent is not bad, and there are things that say that, okay, you can have an accent as long as you are still intelligible and mutually intelligible, across people. And it turns out that for segmental attributes such as phonetic segments, people do adjust. So in fact, there are studies that show that native English speakers, they adjust to grammar errors, to pronunciation errors, but one thing that they don't adjust to is prosodic errors. They actually find that that really impedes intelligibility. So that's a very curious fact. And if you look up, there are books by Bansal which talk about Indian English. They tell you all about the phonetic aspects, but they are quiet on the prosodic aspects. And they have only one thing to say is you better speak with the right prosody. Maybe the Queen's English or whoever's English, but you need that prosody, to sound right and to be intelligible.
Yeah. It sort of reminds me of a recent study that we have been working on, and which is basically on phonetic transfer or accommodation. And it's very interesting that, as you said, at the segmental level, we seem to be accommodating to each other quite well, but prosody is something much higher level and harder to
Adjust to.
Right. All right, so moving on, we have another question from Dr. Sunita Vijay Kumar. We'll put this up on the screen here. Since you're working on the prosodic features, what significance do pronunciation and enunciation have? Because it concerns English, as it is going to alter the entire acoustic feature. So I'll let you answer. Yeah.
Okay. So I'm not really sure. Enunciation, I would understand in terms of maybe articulation. That's one of the problems we have with terminology, actually. Maybe because I'm not from the linguistic, background, but we sometimes are, have used terminology. We see terminology used differently. So enunciation is about articulation, and like we said, is very clear articulation. Articulation is also, as we speak, running, running speech. We don't articulate everything, every segment clearly, but yes, prominent words would get articulated clearly. Pronunciation, if you mean pronunciation by means of the so-called correct pronunciation in terms of, having the right accent, pronouncing the phones as they're supposed to be, it's not very important as long as we model. If we know that our group has a certain L1, that's fine. We could come up with all the pronunciation variations and accommodate that in our model and still treat that as a so-called correctly uttered word when we are doing prosody later.
Great. So next we have a question from Auromita Mitro, and she's asking, do differences in the L1 of the raters also affects how they rate L2 reading?
Yes, I'm sure it does, but we haven't even dared to look at it because it's hard to even enlist raters. It's so hard to get people to commit and complete tasks and so on. So we just go with whoever we get in terms of the prosodic events. When we are doing the high-level ratings, of course, we are very particular to go to very experienced English teachers, and these are the people we also hold discussions with, apart from just using their ratings as data. Yes, but I'm sure that's. But if they're language teachers, then they probably already understand very well how to accommodate L1 in their kind of perspective of the child skill.
So I'm going to take this opportunity to plug actually Jennifer Cole's talk, which is going to happen. Well, she's doing an asynchronous talk, but she's going to be available for Q&A, and she is in fact going to be talking about RPT. So I request all our viewers to join in on 16th of November, which is when the Q&A will happen, and she will discuss in detail the RPT framework that she has, that Professor Preeti Rao also has used extensively. Okay, so the next question we have is from Desi Kalakar. So in India, children are generally not monolinguals, therefore some influences from other languages might come in. So how can we dissociate the interlingual influence?
Yes, of course, that's a complication. And, while we, in our metadata, we do record the child's native tongue to see, what kind of dependencies are. We haven't really looked at their multiple languages. Yes, you're right. There might be influences that a speaker, fluent in both Marathi and Hindi, realizes English, a prosody in a different manner from, let's say, a speaker who speaks Marathi alone. Yes, you're right.
So moving on, we have a question, two questions from Shormishta Shorkar. We'll do the first one first. Since L2 learners go through different levels of proficiency, are there different dynamic modes of the said model to judge the progressiveness of the increasing proficiency, or is it a single model?
So the way we did this is we had the raters give us ratings on a scale. So we would have like a 3-point scale or a 4-point scale, and the ratings we were doing were confined to prosody. So these children were already very good word decoders. So we found the granularity of that was sufficient, to give us actually 2 or 3 levels. That's what we are working with.
And Shomishna has another question. How accommodating this said model is to judge the prosodic proficiency of languages cutting across different typological differences.
Yeah, so like I said, we've looked at only one category of language so far. So I really can't say very much about other languages. But like I said, is that since this is a mix of a data-driven and a linguistic knowledge approach, the better the sources of data are and the more linguistic knowledge we come to bear on it, I'm sure we can try and accommodate the kind of language differences that you refer to.
Great. So I'm going to take, as the moderator's prerogative, ask you a couple of clarification questions. And so one of the things that that sort of has intrigued me, especially about sort of doing subjective and data-driven things together, right? To bring together sort of subjective knowledge. And sort of enmesh them with data-driven approaches. So we are pretty, I guess, objectively sure about certain things that we do when we are using data-driven techniques, right, or mathematical techniques for that matter. The question would be that how do we sort of develop best practices for even rating something, right? So how do we sort of so naturally, garbage in, garbage out. Since in the training process, right, in some ways the rating is sort of enmeshed, or it's going into it. How do we sort of establish that? So if you look at the RPT, right, they're sort of relying on the fact that it'll be just the ratings are going to be so many that we will kind of go over the edge in terms of whatever inaccuracies there are. So the inaccuracies are at the lower end of the spectrum. The higher end of the spectrum, they're kind of flatten out, so it will all be good. So the question is that in a country like India, we may not always have the luxury of implementing something like RPT, right? So how do we sort of think of best practices in terms of ratings?
Yeah, I think your answer is as good as mine or anyone else's. So, like I mentioned, even designing those scales and the questions to ask our experts, it was just so critical because, what did they understand from the questions? What did they pull out from their understanding? When we tried to change the rating scale, we suddenly found that they were doing something else, and then we had to go back and have another discussion. So I agree that getting good training data is a big challenge, and we just use inter-data agreements to tell us about the quality of our data. But in something like this, we find, for example, there are so-called strict teachers, and there are some called lenient teachers, who choose different parts of the scale. Then we try to see whether they at least agree on somebody's better than somebody, even if they don't give the same absolute mark. So, we look into all of these to, somehow, kind of summarize the validity of the data. But I'm
Yeah.
sure there are many, many issues that.
Yeah, so hopefully, and again, I will tell all our viewers to join us in No Coda for a concurrent discussion after this. One of the things that we are sort of concerned about, I think, is sort of standardizing a lot of these subjective, and this goes like, for instance, if you have something like Toby, is it possible to basically build frameworks that are reasonably stable across languages, right? So when we do actually use them in our machine learning models, at least we are not overloading the system with an amount of variance for which we have no explanation, right? So in some ways, I think that this, whether the L1 influence or in the Indian context, I suppose L2 and L3 influence, who knows, how does that sort of impact? So that's something that, I think will be interesting to talk about. We have another question from Sneha Gupta. Can the same model be helpful in determining language learning process of Indian or any other international languages? I guess it would be about foreign language, which I guess Indian English is not.
Yeah, actually, Sneha, this is a pretty bare bones model. So there are a lot of things being filled in by the data or on the particular design and so on. So yes, at the very essential or skeletal or abstract level, yes, we could apply it. So it would be very interesting to apply it to language learning. So I think the important thing that comes out is, yes, we try and separate segmentals from prosodic phenomena, and then which I think would hold true for any language. So there are many things that actually can be extended, of course, provided we have the right data and the right linguistic knowledge.
Great. I think we have pretty much come to the end of the questions. So I just wanted to take this opportunity to, I don't know if everybody can see, and I just wanted to thank you, Professor Rao, for giving us this really, really interesting talk. And it's because of you and all the other speakers that we are able to actually move on with the IndoPhone project, and we have sort of long-term goals. And thank you very much for helping us, in that, hopefully arriving at that goal. So in an effort to show our gratitude, we basically are sort of offering financial assistance to students towards buying data packs, purchasing data packs, because so that these talks can reach even places where it's harder to find or find data. So we are also indebted to an artist, Koel Bishash, for this pencil on paper portrait. And Koel is basically, she's a student at the moment. She's a master's degree in student in linguistics and language technology from Tejpur University, and she completed her BA in English honors, and is from a small town called Tangla in Udalguri district in Assam. And she has been she has interest in traditional painting, digital painting, and sketches, and she actually finished this portrait. It's a basically pencil on paper, and she finished it in just one day. And so we are really thankful to Koel for her valuable time and contributions. So at some point, I imagine that we are going to make sure to, have this delivered to you.
Thank you. That's absolutely brilliant. Yeah, thank you, Koel. Yeah, I didn't know how we would do Memento online, but I can't even imagine anything better than this. Yeah, thanks so much.
So thank you for in a normal conference, I suppose we would have had had some kind of way of thanking you properly, but this is we are
This
thankful
is
to Koel for
better than
for
proper,
giving
yeah.
us-
Thank you so much. Yeah.
So I just want to remind all our viewers that please join us on 20th October for this conversation between Professors KP Mohanan and Tara Mohanan on leading ideas in phonetics and phonology with a historical perspective. And again, finally, I want to thank Professor Preeti Rao for giving us so much of your time, for your giving us an absolutely fantastic talk. Which was very, very thought-provoking, and I hope that we are able to continue the conversations in our No Coda platform. And please do let us know, what we can do as a community, and I hope that the conversations basically stay open, and we are able to build a very strong sort of phonetics, phonology, speech technology ecosystem in this country. And we are able to basically move forward. So thank you so much, Professor Preeti Rao. We will go offline now, but if there is any questions, then I hope people will tweet to IndoPhone, to No Coda,
Sure.
and on social media. So.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Indranil. You've been a great host, and of course, thank you to the audience. And finally, thank you again, Koel. I look forward to receiving that lovely pencil sketch very soon.
Thank you. Okay.
Yeah, bye.